Before moving on to more examples of drawing things in perspective, let's talk first about line quality and line weight. You have heard me saying it a lot in the previous lessons. Adding line weight as a last step to make objects look more in 3D and emphasize certain parts of the object, moving it back or forward in perspective, doing all that by adding thinner or thicker lines. So let's talk about line quality. Before I start, a lot of what I'm going to discuss here comes from different artists' books and videos like Scott Robertson, Feng Zhu, Proco, and many others. So consider this video as an introduction to line weight before you move on to an in-depth lessons by the mentioned artist. Line quality and line weight include the following subjects, which we will talk about here. And these are practicing dynamic sketching, ambient occlusion, shadows, light, edge form, interior details, form lines, section lines, overlapping forms, corners and creases, weight, overlapping exterior versus interior lines, foreground versus background, leading the eye of the viewer, large versus small elements, underside versus topside, openings, fading lines, tapering, and starting light to dark. Every one of these could be a lesson on its own, but I will try to cover all of them at once, and if we need to expand on one or all of them later on, we will do that as well. To start with line weight, we need to practice drawing the lines first. The quality of the lines depends on how good you are at drawing the line and how clean and straight they will look like. Here are some of the ways we can use to practice line quality on a daily basis till we get the hang of the line weight. Dynamic sketching is something you would do every day as a warm-up session before you start drawing, just to get yourself in the mood. This will build upon blind contour technique that we did in earlier lesson. It's all about making sure to follow the lines exactly in straight, clean lines without going all over the place. So let's start with drawing line exercises. Start with drawing different length lines and then try your best to draw on top of these lines without using rulers or a shift key. Make sure you don't go all over the place. Just stay on top of the line as much as you can. If you need to rotate the canvas, go ahead, as long as you can stay on top of the line every time you draw a new line. Once you practice the horizontal lines, you can now draw the vertical lines and draw on top of them. It will be harder the more you rotate the angles of the lines, because you won't be as used to that new angle as you are with the normal way you draw. You can also do diagonals and draw on top of them while making sure your lines don't expand as you draw on top. Make sure the lines stay thin, which means you are hitting the correct path of the line below it. Once you finish practicing straight line for the whole sheet, you can move on to curved lines. Different length of curved lines, different direction, and make sure you hit the exact part without going all over the place as well. Next, you can draw C-curves or S-curves, or maybe a sine wave, and make things harder and harder as you go up the difficulty level. And try again to hit the exact path with quick and clean lines. Maybe change the color of the original path line and draw with lighter lines on top, so you still can see where the path is underneath your lines. Next, you can move on to dots. Draw two dots in random places, and then try to connect in between with one straight, clean line. Don't try to scratch your way from one dot to the other, just one quick, straight line to connect in between. After that, you can do the same with a curved line this time, instead of a straight line, and see if you can hit it with one line. Next, you can try three dots, and try to connect in between the three dots with straight line or curved lines. Then 4 dots, and try to draw a clean rectangle. And maybe you can draw diagonals from the corners again with clean lines. You can go up as much as you want with 5 dots, 6 dots, and so on. The next exercise would be drawing ellipses. This is gonna be a hard one. but try to draw guidelines for each row and make sure your ellipse is drawn as circles first, equal from all sides, and fit between the two lines. Fill the whole row of a page from one side to the other with these circles. Next row would be diagonal ellipses, as a 45-degree ellipse that fit in between the lines leaning toward the right. Next row, minus 45 degree to the left. Again, try to fit it in between the lines. And go slower here. I'm going faster because I just want to demonstrate it for you. But you should take your time and make it much cleaner than mine here. Next row, you can mix between the vertical ellipses and the horizontal ellipses, making sure it's a round ellipse and not a pointy one. And you can fill a whole page drawing these in different orientations. Next sheet, you can draw a horizontal line, pick a vanishing point, and draw perspective lines coming out of it. Now you can fill these perspective rows with perspective ellipses that goes back into the horizon, getting smaller and smaller as you go back in perspective. This will be very handy for you later on when you want to draw ellipses in perspective for your own designs. Try to fill a whole page going around and around in all directions, making sure that the ellipses are drawn clean and smaller in size as they move back into the horizon. If you fill a whole page like this, your line quality will just get better and better as you do more and more of them. Okay, moving on to the next sheet, let's divide it into rows and start drawing some textures. For example, hatch lines. Vertical, horizontal, diagonal hatch lines. This will help with your hatching and sketching lines. You can make the texture look like a weaved fabric using opposite diagonal lines, making it look like a nice texture. Try to get creative as you go along. Search for textures online and try to replicate them using simple lines, using rectangles, circles, triangles, and so on. You can also use the curved lines, which will look like scales or a flower petal and so on. You can also try to replicate animal skins, scales, patterns, and many more. Moving on to the next sheet, you can just straight up start drawing boxes in perspective. Many boxes. Going in different directions, different orientations, different heights, different sizes, and different locations. Just fill up a whole sheet with boxes going all around. Maybe try some boxes leaning on other boxes, maybe falling around. You can use either the technical lines and perspective lines or freehand the whole thing. Just make sure your lines are clean and straight. And again, take your time. I'm just trying to demonstrate the example without going in details here. Next sheet will be cylinders, cones, pyramids, and other basic shapes drawn all over the sheet using 1, 2, or 3-point perspective. You can as well draw advanced shapes like the torus shape, trapezoids, cylinders, spheres, rings, wheels, or even organic shapes. You can fill sheets and sheets of paper of different types of shapes and lines to sharpen your line quality. The more you do this either every week or every day, the better your line quality will be. Drawing blind contour exercises also sharpen your eye-hand coordination, which make you even better at these exercises. And I made an earlier video on that technique last year, as I mentioned, that you can check out as well. So do them as much as possible to get better at line quality. So now that we did some exercises to develop our line quality, let's now learn about line weight. When and why do we use thicker or thinner lines in an object? When to draw darker or lighter lines, and so on. So let's look at the first condition, ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion happens when an area is obstructed by an object that no light can penetrate into that area. So it's basically incomplete shadow. Let's take this box for example. This box is sitting on the ground. The area in between the box and the ground is where the ambient occlusion will happen. Let's zoom in to this corner. Even if the corner isn't 100% sharp, the area between the corners and the carpet or the floor will be occluded by the object itself, so that it will be completely dark. Since objects are not glued to the floor underneath it, they will always have a tiny space in between them and the ground that will give a slightly darker shade underneath the object. So whenever you draw objects sitting on the ground or other objects, there will be slightly darker line in between them to separate them apart. Now you don't go all over the shape with the same thickness, otherwise it will look like a weird outline, only underneath the object and in between them. For example, if we have another box sitting very close next to the one we have, then there will be a slight gap in between. This space will also be in a dark, thick line. But between the other box and the background, the line will be thinner. So ambient occlusion will dictate the thicker and darker lines to separate the objects between each other and to suggest darker shadows in that area. This is of course in case of drawing. In painting, we simply paint the values without any lines in between. The same will be for the carpet and the ground beneath it. It will always have a thicker line there to represent the ambient occlusion. Now even though I'm representing the ambient occlusion with thick lines, I do this only in drawing, as I mentioned. In painting, the ambient occlusion is more of a value area instead of a thin line. But that is a subject for a different video. Now you may ask why the carpet doesn't have a thick line all around. I mean, it's sitting on the ground from all sides, right? Well, that's because of another factor that we will discuss later, which is the atmospheric perspective. As things go back in perspective, the lighter the lines will be, and as they get closer to us, the thicker the lines will be. So keep that in mind for later. Let's move on to other factors like light and shadow. Line weight will be affected by light and shadow. Areas that are hit by direct light will have lighter edges, since the values there will be high. Areas that are in the shadows will have darker edges, since they have darker values. It doesn't have to be a difference between thicker and thinner lines, but more like dark versus light edges. We have this box, for example, being hit by the light from the back side, casting the shadow in the front. So you'll have the previous ambient occlusion in the bottom, which will be the thickest. Then we have three edges in the shadow, and the light top edge being hit by the light. So the vertical edges that are in the shadow will be dark, and the top one will be lighter. But not all light and dark edges will be the same. Interior light edges will be lighter than the exterior ones, and the same for the shadow areas, something we will talk about again later. But for now, shadow edges will have darker lines than the lighter edges. Next factor is the edges around the areas where the form change. For example, in this car, we can see on the side how the edges change from one form to the other. These sudden changes in form will have an edge that starts light and gets darker the harder the edge gets. Think of it as an angle. When the angle between two forms is 0 degrees, the edge thickness will be at 0 opacity. And as the angle between the two forms increases, so will the thickness of the edge. The next factor is interior details. As we saw before, interior details will have way less thickness than the exterior ones. The reason is the exterior edges have to separate the object from other objects or from the wall itself, while the interior edges are mainly details. So we don't need to make them as thick as the exterior ones, otherwise your drawing will be very confusing to look at. If we zoom in, we see these little details on the side, and you can see how the exterior part of it is thick, while the interior edges are not. This way you can tell the difference of what's outside and what's inside. It's part of the industrial design method that makes things look very pleasing to look at. We will see more examples on this later on. Next we have the form lines and section lines. We talked about these before in perspective tools, but here we will talk about how to deal with them in line weight. As we learned before, the form lines are lines moving on top of the object itself, while the section lines are the plane cutting through the object itself, and it can be in any orientation. So let's see how this will affect our line weight. Let's say we have this tree branch. The form lines that will move on top of the outer edge of the branch are form lines describing the form of the branch itself. They are thin lines that get thinner as the areas get smaller. But even as the thicker areas, it won't be as thick as the outline. Now if you want to add section lines, we will have to do it very lightly, all the way around the branch to show the shape of it, as if we cut it out. Now we won't use section lines as much, but we might use form lines to describe the object we draw in most cases, but both will be done very lightly. Overlapping forms is when one object is in front of the other. We talked about this in Perspective Principles lesson. The edge where these objects meet will be thicker on the object in the front to separate it from the object on the back. Otherwise, they will look like one object. The same will be between the little fabric on the ground eclipsing the bottom of the apples. It will also start having a thicker line as it eclipses the apples. This way the objects will have their own space, and it will also tell us which is in the front and which is in the back, giving us more depth of field information than if it was all one line thickness. When the overlapping ends, the thickness of the line will just taper off. Let's look at another example here with more objects in it. We have to first identify which object is in the front and which is overlapping with the others. So the lemons are overlapping with each other and the bag behind it, but the leaves are overlapping with the lemons. So we have to separate them with thicker lines. But remember that the thickness of the lines won't be the same everywhere. It will become thinner as we go back into the perspective or the background. So the front lemon will have an outline, not all the way around it as you see here. I will dial it back a little bit. I'm just trying to separate the objects from each other before deciding how much of a thick line there should be. So as we go back toward the back and the leaves, things will have to be less thicker. Same with the back top. It's overlapping the lemons, so it will have a thicker line, while the lemons themselves are overlapping each other. So we have to separate them with the thicker lines, and the thickness will go less and less as we go back toward the background. Now that I have some line weight, I can zoom out and take a look at the overall image, and then dial back some of the line weight to make it look more organic, and then maybe add some lines that I might have missed. It's also good not to draw a continuous thick line, especially if the edge is too long like the side of the bag. Try to taper it off, especially around the long lines to give it more of an artistic look than a big outline. Otherwise it will look more of a cartoon. More can be done here, but this is just an example of overlapping lines. We will do more about this later. Next we have corners and creases. Corners and creases will have more shadows in them, which is basically due to the shadows in these narrow areas that we mentioned before. So in the corners and the creases of this jacket, light won't be able to get in. So shadows will take over with thicker lines, especially around the corners, and in the area of the creases that we have less light. Again, don't circle the whole thing like an outline. It will just look bad. Try to convey the important information with the least amount of lines possible. As you can see here, the jacket looks good with some thin lines and thick lines at the same time. Tapered outline will give it much more professional look than a complete outline. The 10th factor is weight. What we mean by weight here is the actual weight of an object. So for example, these pillows will have a weight on them on the bottom, because gravity is pulling them down. The weight is the same on all of the pillows, but where they sit on the ground, the weight will be the biggest. Artistic wise, not physics-wise. When we add thicker lines at the bottom, it will make it look like these pillows are not floating. They are on the ground due to their weight. Now you may say that it's like cast shadow we made with the ambient occlusion. Yes, but they also extend, as you can see, upward toward the areas that are not in the ground. This is the connection between the ambient occlusion, the shadow edges, and the overlapping factors altogether. All of them create the illusion of weight of an object. And as you can see, it starts very thick on the bottom and where the pillow's edges touch the ground, and then it tapers off toward the lighter edges on the top. Now they look like they are really on the floor and on top of each other. Another combination of factors is the overlapping of the exterior versus the interior lines. Two factors at once. What do we mean by this? We already learned that the exterior edges are thicker than the interior ones. For example, in this normal box, corners will have a bit more shadows, and it tapers off as they move along the edge, but never as dark as the exterior ones. When we move on to the next box, we see the overlapping interior edges as in the L shape. The corner of the L shape is inside of the box edges, not outside of it. So in this case, the exterior will be the same, but as for the interior, we will see that the outer edges are dark and the interior ones are light. But the top of the L shape is overlapping the bottom of the L shape. So it will be thicker from the exterior and tapers in toward the interior, while the bottom will be lighter and then tapers back toward the thicker exterior. In the next one, we have the same L shape but with a curve instead of a straight line. So here how we deal with this in line weight. Same for the exterior shadow parts and the ambient occlusion in the bottom. But as for the curve, it will be thicker and tapered off toward almost a hair-thick line in the middle, and then back toward the thick exterior line. So the curve thickness will be much less than the straight line thickness, because the angle of the changing form is less in a curve than a straight line. The angle of the straight line is 90 degrees, but the curve will be much less as it goes out. So what if the curve comes to a stop? As we see here in the last example, the curve is overlapping an interior edge, but it's not all the way out. It stops and turns back to a straight edge. Now we do the same for the exterior parts. As for the curve, it will be thick from the exterior part and then tapers off to no edge, with a little dot at the end. We do this as an indication for the inner curve using the lines only. It's just a little indentation used in industrial design to show where the edge ends basically. We can also do form lines to indicate the curves as well in lighter lines. So this is the difference between these shapes and the overlapping exterior versus interior lines. Foreground versus background is something we already covered, but now let's focus on it a bit more. When objects go back into perspective, we will have something called atmospheric perspective. It means that things going back into the horizon will have less details, less colors, less saturation, less values, and less contrast. We can't show any of that with lines, except for the thinner versus thicker lines or line weight. So we have these boxes moving toward the background from the foreground. So let's add the lines like we did in the previous examples, like ambient occlusions, shadow edges, and overlapping objects, and the rest of the factors to all of these boxes. But in the front, the lines will be thicker, and as we go back in perspective, it will be thinner. Same rules, same ambient occlusion, same shadows on all of them, but the thickness of each line will differ. Like the bottom cast shadow in the front box will be thicker than the one behind it, and that will be thicker than the one behind it, and so on. Still following the same rules but not as thick. By doing this, you can already tell that these objects are not in the same perspective depth due to the difference in line weight. You can do the same thing with even one object. It doesn't have to be different objects. If the object is long and wide enough to go from the foreground to the background, it will also have thicker line in front of the viewer and thinner lines as it goes into the background. Here we have a cross that is both in the foreground and moving away from us. The front edge is in the foreground. The right edge is also in the foreground as well, but a little bit behind. The one in the top left is the most far edge we have, followed by the one in the top right. So we deal with the line weight according to this info. The lines will be thicker in the front most edge and thinner as we move back into the background. The right part is almost in the midground, so it will have thicker lines, but in comparison to the foreground, it will be a bit thinner. still maintaining the difference of lines in the same edge, like in between the top and bottom, long edges, and corners. But each area has its own levels of weight. As we go to the background, we can see how thin the lines are getting the more we go back. With this done, we can see the differences between no line weight and with the line weight. It gives the object more character, more life, more depth, and most importantly, a very professional feel to it, that it will plant it in the environment and make it look like an actual object in real life. The next factor is a bit more artistic than physical. This factor is you, the artist. Here is where you decide to control and manipulate the eye of the viewer. For example, we have this sci-fi futuristic prop that is done all in one line thickness. It's boring, it's almost technical, doesn't really have a character. So let's decide first where we want the viewer to look. The important part of this prop is the panel that shows the hazardous label of the materials inside. So let's focus on this and add a thicker line toward that area around the panel. I'm not breaking any rules we talked about here, so I'm still careful where the shadows are, where the light is, but I'm mostly focusing on the area of interest that I want you to look at. If I zoom out, you can already see the effect of it. The rest of the object is there, but not as important for the focal point. You look at the panel right away. This is kind of an advanced stage, but I had to include it here just to let you know that at first you have to follow the physical rules of light, shadows, weight, and so on. But later you can manipulate these rules to serve your purpose of telling the viewer a story, and telling the viewer exactly where you want them to look. It's not arbitrary where you look at when you see a painting. It's mostly done by the artist leading you there, with lines, colors, values, and so on. Back to the normal factors, we have large versus small elements. This is very straightforward. If you have objects all set in the same line of perspective as we see here, the scale of an object will be a factor in line weight. Even though some of these objects are in the back and some are in the front, there are large objects and small objects here. The large objects will have a bigger gap at the bottom and larger weight, which will make the ambient occlusion much larger than it is with the little cup in the front. So if we draw this with the same thick line, it will just look wrong. Even though the cup is in the front, it will still have a thinner line overall than the big one behind it. So these rules have to interact with each other. Each rule depends on the other factors, and as you practice this more and more, things will just make more sense as you observe them, both in other artists' work and in real life as well. As we move on to the medium objects, they will have line weight in the middle zone between the large and the small objects, which will also fit in the larger scheme of things. All these lines are not outlines, as you can tell. They will just be darker around areas where their form shift, like corners, creases, and changing angles, also overlapping and so on. As we look at it, we can see how every thick and thin line fits with the appropriate object size, and it looks much better than one line weight for all. Remember that every object will have its own properties, so adjust its line weight accordingly. Next factor, we have the underside versus the top side. This is again part of the weight principle, not in physics but in art. Here we have two objects, a bottle on the ground and a hanging light. Where the bottle sits on the ground, we will have the ambient occlusion line like we talked about before. Same for the cap top of the main body of the bottle. We will have a thicker line there. But in the case of the hanging light, the bottom of it is a light bulb, which is usually light. So here the shadows will be inverted the other way around. The top line of the object will have more shadows than the bottom one. But even if the light was off, the artistic weight of the light is from the other side, from the chord above. So the thicker lines will be from the top direction. Think of it where the object is pulled toward. The bottle is pulled toward the ground. The light is pulled by the chord upward. Yes, I know that gravity is pulling it downward, but artistically, it looks like it's being pulled upward. Also, the parts itself have overlapping edges from the top, not from the bottom. So that also adds the thickness to the lines. Next factor, we have the openings. There are different types of openings in objects. A complete open hole where you see the other side, an open hole where you don't see the end, or an open hole with a closed back, not all the way to the other side. Each one will have different line weight on the inside. From the outside, they will all have the same line weight of a normal box. But for the first one, the internal hole will be like an external edge. especially in the back part of it, while the internal part of the hole will be considered an interior line, which will be much thinner. The in-between lines will taper from dark to light. As for the hole that has no backside, the lines of the hole in the front will be all interior lines, but two of them will overlap over the other two. So the top and left side will be overlapping the right and the bottom side, so they will be a bit thicker. Here I messed it up at first, but I fixed it later. The top edge will overlap the right edge of the hole, and the left edge overlaps the bottom side of the hole. So these two will be a bit thicker, tapering off as they reach the other side. For the last example, the interior hole is inside the object. The outside edges of the hole will be all interior lines, with no overlaps, so they will all be drawn in thin lines with some darker shades at the corner. The back side of the hole will have the interior lines as well, with a little bit thicker lines since it's more in the shadows than the other parts, since they are inside of the object. And here are all three, with and without the line weight. A big difference. The final factor in the list, we have the fading lines and tapering. We already did some of it in the previous example, when a line starts thick and dark and then taper off toward the light. We mostly use this with curved lines and different depth objects. Here we have a very rounded shape, so the lines won't be all thick all the way around. For example, the bottom step will overlap the bottom, but it won't be one thick line, because it will hit the light in different ways as it turns around. So the lines will have to replicate the same effect by going thick to thin and back to thick again. Same for the edges on the outside. They will start a bit thicker and start tapering off. The thick parts will be in the shadow parts, the corners, the creases, and so on, like we saw before. And they start tapering off as they turn into the interior lines as we see here in the main body. As for the hole, we can treat it as the ones we saw before. The inner hole backside is showing here, so now it's an exterior edge. As for the outer edge, it will taper off from the thick overlapping edge into the interior lighter thin edge. So this variation of thick and thin lines, especially on smooth objects, give it a very interesting look that's separated from the straight shape of a straight blocky object. It's more interesting to look at than the normal one line edge all the way around. Alright, now that we know all the factors of the line weight, let's see how we start drawing these lines. We saw a lot of examples already, but how do we start? We start usually from thick to thin, dark to light. But it's not rules set in stone, of course. Some artists like to start from thin to thick, or light to dark, depending on the object. If the object is in a high key painting, as in more light than shadows, it's better to start light to dark, and vice versa. If the subject is in a low-key painting, as in more shadows than light, it's better to start dark to light. But let's just start here from thick to thin in these upcoming examples. We have two boxes or houses here, one in the front and one in the back, with the light hitting them from the top left. We will use 5 different line thickness for the line weight here. You can go in with more, but I think 5 is enough for most examples. We have a line weight of 10, which is the brush size thickness. Then we have 8, 6, 4, and 2, which is the thinnest. We will use the thickest line weight for the bottom ambient occlusion since it will be the darkest there. But not for both blocks, just the one in the front, since the other one is moving back from us into the background. Next, I will use the 8 points line weight for the overlapping line in between the two buildings. That edge is also a shadow edge, so it gets thicker due to the shadow and the overlapping. Next, I will use the 6-point thickness for the shadow edges, as well as the corners and the creases. Again, only on the front building. The vertical line of the interior part of the building will start as 6 in the corners, but will taper off toward the 4 points line as it gets into the interior part. For the back overlapping side, I will use a 4-point line separating the building from each other, and not as thick as the 6 points on the side, because the top side of the box is in the light, not the shadow. So that would take off 2 points from the darkness scale. Finally, the thinnest line of the 2 points will be used for the rest of the lines, like the interior edge of the top and the door of the building, since they are interior details. To do the background building, we now do the exact same thing we did for the foreground, but we lower everything by 2 points. So we use the 8 points line for the ambient occlusion, the 6 point line for the shadow edges, 4 points for the corners and the tapered thick lines, and finally 2 toward the interior edges but with a lighter touch than the one I did in the first one. If you are using a tablet or drawing traditionally, your 2 points can vary even within the same thickness. A 2-point line can be dark in the front building, but done with a lighter touch in the background building, just to make them look different and to add more of a depth of field illusion. And these are the 2 blocks with different line thickness all done. Let's do another example. We drew this once before, but now let's add the line weight on top. Using the same technique we just used on the building. Thick 10 points line for the bottom cast shadow, 8 for the back edge away from the light, and a thinner line as it goes toward the lighter top. The bottom edge of the top lip of the object can also have some shadows since it's moving away from the light, but not as thick as the one in the background. The corners of the shape, especially in the deep interior, can have darker tone, but it goes thinner as it moves out. The line of the slide, especially where it turns from the interior to the exterior, will have more thickness before tapering off toward the interior again. The rest of the lines will be thinner and tapering off almost to nothing as they move inside the interior space. You can add more thickness on the corner to give it a bit more character, here and there. Also thinning the lines on the long edges to make it less boring. And this is the difference between no line weight and with line weight. Line weight makes all the difference, doesn't it? Let's move on to another example we did before, a toy train. Let's start adding the thick lines first. Now even though the body isn't on the ground, it still has some thickness for the cast shadow. But the wheels are on the ground, so they will have the same thickness as well. You can make the wheels shadow a bit thicker if you want, but it's okay to make the whole thing at one thickness as well. Next we have the main tank sitting on the body, also having a thick cast shadow in between the body and all the way to the back, with tapered thin line in the middle. You can follow the same concept from the reference photo. You can see where the lines get lighter and where they get darker. The chimney is overlapping the cabin behind it, so it will have some darker lines there. And on the bottom as well as the exterior part. We will nail down some of this thickness at the end with the overall look to the object, but for now we are just putting down the main shadow and the light lines as the initial draft. The wheels also overlap the body behind it, so it will have some shadow there, but it has to be a bit thinner than the bottom, which we will increase its thickness later on. The cabin have a window acting as a hole, which make the edge on the right overlapping the interior, giving it a thicker line. Adding more shadow on the corners of the tank on the front. Moving around, adding now medium to thin lines for the exterior, overlapping objects, and thinner lines for the interior ones. And now I realize the lines are a bit too small on the bottom and also on the shadow edge, so I increase the thickness of the ambient occlusion lines to separate it from the rest. I'm also tapering off some of the continuous shadows and the continuous light edges to make it look a bit more interesting. Long monotone lines that never change gets boring to look at, so make it look a bit more interesting with a variation of thick and thin areas. Added the final touches all around while being zoomed out, just to see the overlook of the whole object and not focusing on one tiny area instead. And it's done. It looks good with all the line weight drawn down. Let's do one final example. I know this lesson is getting long, but this one is very complicated, and it has all the factors we studied, including the artistic ones. So we need to create a hot map for this image, where we want the viewer to look at first, before adding the line weight. If we add the line weight for all of the drawing, it will take forever, and it won't be as interesting even with all the hard work. So it's a waste of time and effort, and the viewer will be lost looking at it. So let's make a hot zone map. First we decide where the focus point is. Let's say these two pillars in the center are the focus point. The intermediate zone will be the area around it, including the tree roots. And the low interest zone will be the area around that with some of the ground ties and some of the walls. Finally, the rest will be considered as background. So let's zoom in and start adding the thickest line and values in the focal point of the drawing. Now with the artistic factors decided, we can apply all the physical factors to this area and then taper off the thickness of the line weight as we move out toward the background. So here I'm adding the shadow lines as thick as I can while filling the holes with 100% black paint. Makes it a bit more contrasted this way with the rest of the drawing. Next I add the cast shadow between the tiles and the overlapping shadows between the roots and the tiles. I'm taking my time here and going very slow. I'm trying to convey these photo details in line art. It's not the same without values and colors, so you have to be very precise and very careful where you put your lines. Take your time and enjoy the process, and never rush these things at all. It will look much better when you take your time drawing it. I'm tapering off some of the shadow lines, especially where the shadow stops and the light starts seeping in, to also make it more interesting than one continuous black line. Moving around the focal point, I'm adding some overlapping lines to the roots and the other part of the column. Again, not a continuous line all the way, but with more variety in between. As I reach the end of the focal point area, I'm tapering off the lines to the other area. See, the second area we showed in yellow has the same rules and factors here, but with 2 or 3 points thickness lower. Like we did with the different line weight when we drew the two houses before. We do the same here, lowering the thickness by 2 points or more, as we leave one area to the one behind it. So all the lines here are tapering off from the focal point area to the one after it. And from the second area lines we taper off even more to the one next to it, and so on. I'm adding the final interior lines in thin lines for the textures, dents, thin roots, and the rest of the interior details. Now I'm moving to the second area around the focal point, and already my lines are getting thinner and thinner, but keeping the same rules and factors we used in the focal point. As we venture toward the third area, now the lines are getting almost as thick as the interior lines of the focal point. That's how different things are getting. But we are still using different lines for each area, so it still has some character in it, but not so much that it will take away the focus from the focal point. You do not want to distract the viewers with sudden contrast away from the focal point unless you want two different focal points in your drawing, which is something you can do. The final zone which we decide to be the background, I almost keep it all in thin lines, because it doesn't matter that much. When you look at this drawing now, all you see is where I lead you to look, the two columns and the hole above it. Now I'm even adding hatched lines for the hole to make sure that this is where you have to look, and you wonder where this hole will lead. You try to look around to the background, but the thick lines and values will always bring you back to the focal point. This is why line weight and line quality are so important. It's one of the tools you can use as an artist to control the viewer's eye and make it look where you want it to look, especially in line art and drawing. In painting, we can do the same with values, colors, contrast, and so much more. But in line art and drawings, all we have is line weight and hatching. We have way fewer tools to use to control the viewer's eye here. So that makes it even more important to learn, to practice, and to use in your own work. And this is the final drawing. Look how different it is with and without the line weight. It looks professionally done. It has more character, it has more story, more contrast, and more detail than when it was done on all one monotone line thickness. I can work on this for hours more, but I think we got the point of the exercise. And now it's your turn. Go back to the first part of this lesson and start with the line quality first. Make sure your lines are clean and straight, and practice on many sheets how to draw clean lines. After that, study each factor and do as many examples as possible on each one. Finally, find complex examples like we did here and start adding more flavor to your work. Line weight will completely change the way your art looks like. It's the difference between a good drawing and a boring one. And this is just the introduction to line weight. I encourage you to go after this and watch some Scott Robertson videos or read some of his books on this subject. We barely touched the surface here. He goes in deep with the subject, with way better art than mine. So do that next if you want to learn more about line quality and line weight. For the next lesson, we will continue back where we left off from drawing objects to drawing scenes using technical drawing and freehand techniques. I just wanted to do this little detour to explain things better, that when I say add the final layer of line weight after each example, now you understand what I mean, and hopefully you can now do it yourself. In the next lesson, we will draw a chair, a still life painting, an interior room, and an exterior house, going from an object to a full scene. It will be the point where we stop drawing boxes and props to where we start drawing full scene, all in perspective. It has been a long way to get here. I hope you did all the practice before moving on, and once you're done, let's move on to the next stage of perspective drawing. As always, if you like this lesson, feel free to leave a like. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section, and I will do my best to answer them as soon as possible. To stay notified for future lessons, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.